Her mother's needle never stopped moving, even when the magistrate's men carried the ledgers out the front door. Clara Winslow sat by the window of the printer's shop on Feld Street, counting the coins left in the tin box for the third time that morning, as though a different number might appear if she tried hard enough. 19 shillings. Her husband had been dead 11 months, and the print shop he'd left her. The one with his name still painted above the door in flaking gold letters, Thomas Winslow, printer and bookbinder, owed £40 to men who did not care that she had a 6-year-old son sleeping upstairs and a set of hands that could set type faster than any journeyman in Bristol. She had learned the trade at her father's elbow before she'd learned to write her own name in cursive. He'd been a printer too, and a careful one, the kind who checked every galley twice and taught his daughter to read a page of reversed type as easily as she read it right side up. When Thomas had come courting, it was the ink under her nails that caught his eye before her face did, or so he'd always claimed. 3 years of marriage, 1 son. Then a fever that took him in 4 days, and left Clara holding a business, a debt, and a boy named Peter who still asked, some mornings, when his father was coming home from his trip. The knock at the door that afternoon was not a creditor's knock. It was too soft, too deliberate, and it came from a man in a grey coat who introduced himself as Mr. Aldous Penny, solicitor, acting on behalf of His Grace the Duke of Merrow. Clara had never heard the name Merrow spoken aloud in Bristol without someone lowering their voice after it. The old Duke had died 3 years past. His son, the new Duke, had not been seen in society since. Not at balls, not at the assizes, not at church. There were stories, the kind that travelled through kitchens and market stalls faster than any newspaper, that he'd been disfigured in the same carriage accident that killed his father, that he did not receive visitors, that the great house at Merrow Fell had gone quiet as a tomb and stayed that way. Mr. Penny did not waste time on pleasantries. He informed Clara Winslow that the Duke of Merrow required a wife promptly, and that her name had come to his attention through a channel Mr. Penny was not at liberty to discuss. The marriage would clear the debts of the print shop entirely, all £40, and would settle upon her and upon her son an allowance for life, regardless of what became of the marriage itself. Why me? Clara said. It was not really a question. She had asked it of the empty room 100 times since Thomas died, about smaller things, and never once received an answer worth having. Mr. Penny folded his hands. His Grace did not confide his reasons to me, madam. Only his instructions. She thought of Peter asleep upstairs, of the £40, of the men who would come again on Friday with their ledgers and their patient, terrible politeness. She thought of 19 shillings in a tin box. I'll need 3 days, she said. You have one, said Mr. Penny, and set an envelope on the counter, sealed in dark green wax with a crest she didn't recognise, and let himself out into the grey Bristol afternoon. She married him on a Thursday, in a chapel so small it barely qualified as one, with Peter standing beside her in his one good coat, gripping her hand hard enough to hurt. Merrow Fell was 4 days' journey from Bristol, out past the last towns Clara knew the names of, into country that grew wilder and quieter with every mile, until the carriage turned through gates topped with stone hawks and rolled up a drive lined with elms so old, their branches met overhead like the ribs of something enormous and long dead. The house that waited at the end of it was beautiful in the way a locked door is beautiful. Grey stone, ivy trimmed with surgical precision, windows that reflected the sky, and nothing else. A woman met them on the steps, tall, silver-haired, dressed in unrelieved black even 3 years on, who introduced herself as Mrs. Prentice, the housekeeper, and looked at Clara the way one looks at a bill one suspects will not be honoured. His Grace does not come down for arrivals, Mrs. Prentice said, before Clara had even finished climbing the steps. He keeps to the North Tower. You'll dine alone tonight. Peter, she said the name carefully, as though tasting it for the first time, will take his supper in the nursery with Agnes. Clara did not argue. She had learned, in 11 months of widowhood and 11 years of marriage to a trade instead of a man, that arguing accomplished nothing a person couldn't accomplish more quietly, by watching first and speaking later. She dined alone that first night at a table built for 20, in a room lit by candles that left the corners in darkness, and she noticed, the way she noticed misaligned type on a galley proof, that everything in the house was subtly wrong. The portraits along the stairwell were all turned very slightly toward the wall, as though someone had adjusted each one by a careful, deliberate degree. The clocks, she counted 4 in the space of the entrance hall alone, had all been stopped at different hours, and every mirror in the house, she would discover over the following days, had been either removed or covered with a length of black cloth, as if the house were perpetually in mourning for something that refused to be named. She met him on the 3rd night, and not by invitation. Peter had woken crying from a nightmare, and Clara, unfamiliar with the house's corridors, took a wrong turn on her way back from the nursery and found herself in an unlit gallery she didn't recognize, candle guttering in her hand. A door stood ajar at the far end, firelight spilling from it in a long gold stripe across the floor. She should have turned back. She told herself later that she should have turned back. Instead, she walked toward the light, because some part of her, the part that had spent a childhood reading reversed type and finding the error in it, could not resist the shape of an unanswered question. He was standing at the window with his back to the door, tall, dark-haired, dressed in black, that seemed less like mourning and more like a kind of camouflage, blending into the unlit half of the room. He did not turn when the floor creaked beneath her. "You were told to keep to the east wing," he said. His voice was low, unhurried, and it did something strange to the air in the room, the way a held breath does. "I was looking for the nursery. I found this instead. Then you'll leave the way you came." "I will," Clara said. "When I've seen your face." She had not planned to say it. It arrived in her mouth fully formed, the way the misaligned line on a galley-proof arrived in her eye, before she'd consciously begun to look for it. He turned then, slowly, and not toward her exactly, toward the candle, so that the light fell across the left side of his face first. It was for a moment an ordinary face, sharp-boned, dark-browed, handsome in the exhausted way of a man who has not slept well in a long time. Then he turned another few degrees, and the firelight found the other side, and Clara understood, all at once, why every mirror in Merrow Fell had been put away. The scarring ran from his temple to his jaw, pale and old, the kind of mark that had healed as well as such things ever heal, which is to say imperfectly. It was not monstrous. It was not, in truth, even so very terrible to look at, once the first shock of it passed. But it was clearly the sort of thing a man might spend 3 years learning to hate the sight of in every reflective surface in his house. "Now you've seen it," he said. There was no self-pity in his voice. There was something colder than that, something that had had 3 years to settle into permanence. "You may go. Is that why you sent for a printer's widow, instead of a woman of your own rank?" Clara asked. "Because a printer's widow won't know how to flinch properly in front of a duke?" Something moved behind his eyes, not quite surprise, but its cousin. "You didn't flinch at all." "I've set type by candlelight for 11 years, Clara said. "I know the difference between what a thing looks like in poor light and what it is. Your face is not the reason this house is full of covered mirrors, Your Grace. I don't think it ever was." He was silent long enough that she thought she'd overstepped badly enough to be sent from the house entirely, debts or no debts. Then he said quietly, "Go back to the nursery, Mrs. Winslow. Your son is likely still awake." It was, she noticed as she turned to go, the first time anyone in the house had used her name instead of her title. She did not see him again for 6 days. In that time, Clara did what she had always done in a strange room full of unfamiliar type. She read everything she could reach. She read the household accounts which Mrs. Prentice left carelessly unlocked in the study, and found, buried in 3 years of ordinary expenditures, a curious pattern of quarterly payments to a firm of solicitors in London, under the name of Rathbone and Crane, payments that had begun the same month the old Duke died, and continued like clockwork ever since. Growing steadily larger, she read the old Duke's correspondence, gathering dust in a cabinet nobody had thought to lock, and found a half-finished letter, dated 3 days before his death, addressed to a man named Josiah Vane, that spoke of irregularities in the northern acreage that cannot continue, and promised a full accounting upon my return from London. He had never returned from London. The carriage accident that killed him and scarred his son had happened on the London road, and she read, on the 4th day, in a locked drawer she opened with a hairpin, because 11 years married to a man who trusted her with everything had taught her that locks were rarely built to withstand real patience, a coroner's report on the old Duke's death that did not match the story the household told. The official account held that the carriage wheel had failed on a turn. The coroner's report noted, in small, careful handwriting, that the axle bolt recovered from the wreckage showed clean tool marks consistent with deliberate loosening, not the ragged wear of an accident, and that this finding had been quietly set aside at the request of the family solicitor for the preservation of the young Duke's peace of mind during his convalescence. Clara sat with that report open on her lap for a long time, in a library gone grey with afternoon light, and thought of the covered mirrors and the stopped clocks, and a man who introduced himself to his own wife by turning his ruined face toward a candle like a challenge. She found him again in the library on the 7th night, this time because she went looking. He was seated at a desk with a single candle and a stack of estate correspondence, and when she came in he did not tell her to leave. "You've been in the study," he said without turning around. "Mrs." Prentice noticed the accounts had been moved. "I've been in the study, the old Duke's correspondence, and a locked drawer in this library," Clara said, and set the coroner's report on the desk in front of him. "I think you know what's in it, or you wouldn't have 3 years of payments going to Rathbone and Crane, and a house with every clock stopped at the hour your father's carriage went into the ditch." He looked at the report for a long moment without touching it. When he spoke, his voice had lost the flat coldness of their first meeting. What was left underneath it sounded, to Clara's ear, very much like relief, the particular relief of a man who has been carrying something heavy and alone for a long time, and has just been asked by someone strong enough to help to set it down. "My father did not die by accident," he said. "The axle was cut nearly through, and left to finish the work itself on the London road at speed. On a turn he took every week of his life without incident. Someone who knew his habits arranged it precisely. I was riding with him. I saw the wheel go before I felt it. There is a particular sound a sound wheel makes and a cut one doesn't, and I have had 3 years to become an expert in the difference." His hand came up, briefly, toward the scarred side of his face and dropped again. "I have spent 3 years letting the county believe I keep to my tower, because I cannot bear to be looked at. It is easier to be pitied than to be watched. And I have needed very badly not to be watched while I found out who did this. Rathbone and Crane," Clara said. "Are paid," he said. "Be Josiah Vane, my father's man of business, who has controlled the northern acreage rents since before I was born, and who stood to lose a very great deal when my father's letter to him, the one you found unfinished, reached its conclusion. My father meant to dismiss him. Vane could not permit that. He looked at her directly then, without turning his face away, without offering her the profile that hid the worst of the scar. "I have been gathering proof for 3 years from inside a house everyone believes is a tomb. I could not do it as a grieving recluse forever. I needed a wife no one would think to suspect of anything but pity for a scarred duke. A woman with a sharp enough mind to help me finish what my father started, and enough of her own troubles that no one in society would look twice at why she married me." "You needed someone invisible," Clara said. "I needed someone exactly like you," he said. "Everyone in Bristol who owed you money has spent a year looking straight through you, Mrs. Winslow. I imagine you know exactly what that's worth, when you need a person nobody thinks is worth watching." Something in Clara's chest, which had gone very quiet and very careful in the 11 months since Thomas died, turned over once, hard at being seen, actually seen, the whole shape of her circumstances and her competence at once, by a man who had spent 3 years making sure no one saw him at all. "My name is Julian," he said, after a silence that had gone on rather longer than either of them acknowledged. "Not your grace. Not tonight, Clara," she said, and it settled between them the way the right word settles into a sentence that has been missing it. The weeks that followed remade the house from the inside out, though anyone watching from the outside would have seen nothing change at all. By day, Julian kept to the North Tower, and Mrs. Prentice kept the mirrors covered, and the county went on believing what it had believed for 3 years. By evening, after the staff had banked the fires and gone to their beds, the door to the library stood open, and Julian took his supper there with Clara instead of alone, and the two of them built their case against Josiah Vane the way Clara had once set a difficult page of type, one careful, correctable line at a time. She found, in the old Duke's papers, 3 separate letters in Vane's hand that did not match the tenant ledgers he'd submitted for signature, the alterations so fine that only a woman who had spent 11 years matching type to manuscript, catching every printer's error before it reached a customer's eye, would ever have noticed the different pressure of the pen on a forged figure. She found the blacksmith in the village nearest Merrowfell, who still remembered, when asked gently and paid generously, servicing the old Duke's carriage the week before the accident, and swore the axle had been sound when it left his forge. Peter, meanwhile, thrived in a way Clara had not seen since before Thomas died. Julian, it turned out, had a gift for patient explanation that had nothing performative in it. He taught the boy to identify birds from the tower window, correctly and without condescension, and Clara came upon them one afternoon. In the garden, Julian crouched at Peter's height, both of them silent and serious over a wren's nest, and felt something in her chest crack open in a way that had nothing to do with debts or duels or coroner's reports at all. It was Mrs. Prentice, sharp-eyed and tight-lipped through 30 years of service to the Merrow family, who noticed first that something in the house had shifted. She said nothing of it directly, but the mirrors in the west corridor came uncovered one morning without anyone asking, and when Clara mentioned it, the older woman only said, "It's been 3 years, Your Grace. I think perhaps it's time," and did not meet Clara's eye when she said it, though her voice, for the first time since Clara's arrival, was not cold. Josiah Vane arrived at Merrowfell on a Tuesday in late autumn, uninvited and unannounced, having heard, as Julian had intended he should hear, through a carefully placed word to a servant known to gossip, that the young Duke was preparing to review the northern rents personally, for the first time since his father's death. Vane was a broad, florid man with a politician's smile and a handshake that lingered a half-second too long, and he greeted Julian with the easy familiarity of a man who had never once considered that the boy he'd managed since infancy might have grown into someone capable of managing him back. "Your Grace looks well," Vane said, seating himself without being asked, in the drawing-room where Clara sat with her needlework and said nothing at all, exactly as they had planned. "I confess I was surprised to hear you meant to look over the northern accounts yourself. Such matters are dreadfully tedious. I've always been glad to spare you the trouble." "You have spared me a great deal of trouble these 3 years, Mr. Vane," Julian said, and there was something in his voice, pleasant, level, utterly without warmth, that made Clara's needle still in her hand. "I find I would like to understand the northern rents properly before my father's memory grows any dimmer in the county's mind. A son ought to know his father's business." Of course, of course." Vane's smile did not waver, though something behind his eyes had gone very still. "I'll have the current ledgers sent up directly." "I have them already," Julian said. "I have the ones you submitted for my father's signature, and I have the ones the tenants themselves keep, which do not, curiously, agree with yours in 3 particular entries." My wife noticed the discrepancy first. She has rather a gift for reading a line of figures and knowing when it has been altered. Vane's gaze moved to Clara for the first time since entering the room, and she watched him recalculate her entirely, from printer's widow, beneath his notice, to something else. "Your Grace's wife is very clever," he said, and there was no compliment left in the words at all. "She is," Julian said. "She is also the reason I know that the axle bolt recovered from my father's carriage showed tool marks consistent with deliberate damage, rather than the wear the county was told to believe. The coroner's original report survives, Mr. Vane, in my father's own locked drawer, along with a letter he never finished writing to you, in which he informed you he meant to dismiss you from the estate's service before the quarter's end." He set both documents on the table between them. "I have had 3 years in a darkened house to consider, who benefited from my father never sending that letter, and who has grown considerably wealthier from the northern rents in the years since his death than the tenants themselves have grown poorer to account for." The colour had gone entirely out of Vane's face. This is a grave accusation to make on the word of a printer's widow and an old man's ramblings. It is made on the word of a blacksmith who serviced that carriage the week before it went into the ditch, Clara said quietly, setting down her needlework at last, and on 3 forged tenant ledgers, whose alterations I can show you line by line, Mr. Vane, in your own hand, pressed harder on every false figure than on every true one, the way a man's hand always presses harder when he is lying with a pen instead of his mouth. I have read 7 years of my late husband's correspondence, and 11 years of manuscripts before that. I know the shape of an honest line, and I know the shape of one that isn't. 2 men from the county constabulary, who had been waiting the front hall since that morning at Julian's quiet arrangement, entered the drawing room at his nod. Vane did not run. He seemed, in the end, almost relieved to stop pretending, the way a man is relieved to set down a weight he has carried. So long he has forgotten what it felt like to walk without it. In the weeks after Vane's arrest, and the slow unravelling of 3 years of falsified accounts before the county assizes, the mirrors came out of storage one by one, and the clocks were wound and set to the correct hour, and Julian began, for the first time since Clara had known him, to walk through his own house without angling his scarred cheek away from the light. He found her in the garden on a grey afternoon some weeks later, where she sat with Peter's kite tangled hopelessly in the elms, and no real intention of untangling it just yet. "I married you to survive my father's murderer," Julian said, sitting beside her on the cold stone bench, not bothering to keep the scarred side of his face from the wind. "I find I would like to stay married to you for reasons that have nothing to do with him at all." "Say them," Clara said. "You are the only person who has looked directly at my face in 3 years and asked a question about the house instead of about the scar," he said. "You taught my staff to stop being afraid of their own reflections. You have a mind like a well-run press, Clara. Nothing gets through it uncorrected, least of all me." He took her hand, turning it over, tracing the calluses across her fingers that 11 years of setting type had left behind. "I have been a ghost in my own home for 3 years, so that a murderer would not think to watch me too closely. I find I no longer want to be a ghost with you in the house." "You looked me in the eye the first night we met," Clara said, "when you could have turned your face away and let me believe whatever the county already believed. I've been staying since then, Julian. I only needed you to notice." He kissed her there in the garden, with Peter's kite still stuck fast in the branches above them, and the last of the autumn light going gold across the stopped, then unstopped, then finally correct clocks of Merrow Fell, and neither of them moved to fetch the kite down for a long while yet. 2 years later, Merrow Fell no longer resembled the house Clara had first walked into. The mirrors hung uncovered in every hall. The clocks kept honest time. Peter had grown 3 inches and acquired a small dog and an alarming quantity of opinions about birds. In the garden, on a warm afternoon, Julian sat with an infant daughter against his shoulder, pointing out a wren's nest in the hedge, with the same patient seriousness he'd once shown a 6-year-old boy who badly needed someone to be patient with him. And Clara watched them from the library window, with her hand pressed flat against her chest, where the feeling that had no name had finally decided to stay. A letter arrived that afternoon from the county assizes, forwarded by their solicitor, confirming that Josiah Vane's trial had been set for the spring term, and enclosing, on a separate slip marked for Her Grace's eyes only, a note stating that a second hand had been discovered on one of the altered tenant ledgers, a hand that was not Vane's, and had not yet been identified. Clara read it twice, and looked out through the glass at her husband and her daughter, and the wren's nest in the hedge, and picked up her pen. There was, it seemed, more work still to do.